Hello everyone, my name is Alyssa Baker Oglesby and I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I am happy to welcome everyone tonight. I'm pleased to see all in attendance. There are a lot of you. That's great. And I would invite you to meditate on the fact that Northwestern University sits on the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples. This land was important in trade, travel, hunting, and gathering for over a dozen other tribes, including the Miamia, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. This land and the surrounding Chicago area continues to sustain Native peoples today. By acknowledging the original and continuing relationships of Native peoples to this land, we hope to provide consideration of the ways in which we have all benefited from challenges to these enduring relationships, and further, how we may all enact practices that honor and reinstate these relationships. The inspiration for this symposium was born late last academic year when the Kaplan Institute for the Humanities circulated its call for co-sponsorships. The leaders of the Colloquium on Indigeneity and Native American Studies, being myself and Bonnie Etherington, proposed to collaborate on a symposium that would create a conversation around indigenous sovereignty, its definitions, its manifestations, and its paradoxes, to use a word from Dr. Kauanui's new book. Since the Kaplan theme for programming this year is security, we felt it was important to consider this theme, often manifested in discussions of homeland security or border security, in light of indigenous homelands on which the United States and other settler states sit. Any U.S.-based sense of national security rests on the theft of indigenous lands. And we wanted to facilitate a conversation today about the ways that that theft creates and complicates definitions and acts of indigenous sovereignty. We are especially excited to welcome these three scholars today as their work approaches sovereignty from historical, political, and linguistic contexts, and as they collectively show us some of the surprising ways in which sovereignty is enacted, lived, undercut, and so on. We are grateful to be collaborating not only with the Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, but also with the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and the Office for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. I will briefly introduce each speaker before turning things over to our moderator, Bonnie Etherington. Each speaker will present for about 10 minutes, then Bonnie will moderate a conversation between all three of the speakers, focusing on questions and shared threads that came up during their presentations. After this conversation, we'll make time for audience questions. Dr. Jenny L. Davis is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she is the director of Native American and Indigenous Languages Lab, as well as an affiliate faculty of American Indian Studies and Gender and Women's Studies. Her book, Talking Indian, Identity and Language Revitalization in the Chickasaw Renaissance, and additional publications focus on Chickasaw language revitalization. Her co-edited volume, Queer Excursions, Re-Theorizing Binaries in Language, Gender, and Sexuality, was awarded the Ruth Benedict Book Prize from the Association for Queer Anthropology and the American Anthropological Association.
I'll bring you guys with me. You're kind of tight people tonight, guys. All right.
Dr. Kēhaulani Kauanui is Professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty member in anthropology at Wesleyan University, where she serves as the current chair of the American Studies Department and the current director of the Center for the Americas. She has two new books, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism, which examines myriad contradictions of indigeneity and self-determination vis-a-vis U.S. domestic policy and international law. Thank you, thank you. And speaking of indigenous politics, Conversations with Activists, Scholars, and Tribal Leaders, which features select interviews from her public affairs radio show, Indigenous Politics, which aired from 2007 to 2013. She is also the author of Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity. Dr. Doug Kiel is a citizen of the Oneida Nation and an assistant professor of history and faculty in the Kaplan Institute for the Humanities. He is working on a book manuscript entitled Unsettling Territory, Oneida Indian Resurgence and Anti-Sovereignty Backlash, and is also the author of many articles on blood quantum, the indigenous Midwest, Native American activism, and Red Power. Before I turn things over to Bonnie, I would like to invite you all to attend Kaplan Security Dialogue's winter keynote on January 24th, which will be delivered by Patrice Cullors, Smooth, who is the co-founder of the Black Lives Movement, or Black Lives Matter. So now I hope you will join me in welcoming our guests with a round of applause. Well, no.
So we're going to speak in alphabetical order today, so please welcome again Professor Jenny Davis.
Right, Chokma and Chokmashki to the organizers of the symposium for bringing us all together and inviting me to speak on these indigenous lands as a guest in Illinois and in these northern Illinois spaces. And my apologies for reading my comments, but that's the best way to keep me at 10 minutes on anything. As tonight's discussion will no doubt demonstrate, sovereignty is a mercurial concept to pin down. Capturing a concise definition of what linguistic sovereignty is or might encompass is equally tricky. It may be that, like pornography, we know it when we see it. But today I'm going to take an opposite approach. That is, trying to tease out what linguistic sovereignty is by examining some context where it is most glaringly absent, and hopefully, in the process, getting a clearer picture of what it might be. So to do so, I'll be giving a quick analysis of the most commonly circulating rhetorics and narratives around Indigenous language endangerment. From BBC News and The Guardian, The New York Times, and Huffington Post, endangered languages are an increasingly pervasive topic in the media. The rhetorical strategies deployed in these media discussions intend to raise public awareness about language endangerment. But as I'll briefly show today, they in fact draw on long-standing trends within settler societies that undermine linguistic sovereignty. The first trend that emerges in media coverage of language endangerment is linguistic extraction, or defining, analyzing, and representing languages and the people connected to them separate from the complex socio-historical, political, and deeply personal context in which they actually occur. Linguistic extraction, then, renders languages into extractable objects that can be collected, preserved, utilized, and even admired. Critically, linguistic extraction is not solely the collection of indigenous languages in ways that often render them inaccessible to their communities, but also the presentations of languages as objects or data within their complex and varied human contexts, or without their complex and varied human contexts. Like the natural resources and treasures with which indigenous languages have frequently been aligned, languages, as whole or in their comprising pieces, are frequently utilized in processes labeled mining and harvesting by researchers within this extractive framework. In other words, this literal and metaphorical extraction from context is itself a colonial enterprise, one that celebrates the empire in empirical. Linguistic extraction also happens in the valuing of linguistic data over the speakers that produce it and the communities and contexts in which it is produced. Take, for example, this representative excerpt from a 2007 National Geographic article titled "Languages Racing to Extinction in 5 Global Hotspots." Setting the backdrop up for the story's focus on language endangerment, this quote begins with this quote: "In the last 500 years, an estimated half of the world's languages, from Etruscan to Tasmanian, have become extinct. But researchers say the languages of the world are now vanishing faster than ever in recorded history. More than 500 languages may be spoken by fewer than 10 people." In this article, decontextualized enumeration allows for the available numbers to appear randomized, as though in our world with thousands of languages, any one is equally at risk of endangerment. In reality, such numbers are embedded in particular and interrelated geographic, socioeconomic, familial, and historical contexts. Their rhetorical presupposition reveals another level of extraction frequently utilized in media discussion of language endangerment: the erasure of the factors that shape language shift. In this National Geographic article, no rationale is given for why the last 500 years might be a significantly different moment in language transmission, even though it coincides with the period of European and American colonialism and globalization. This form of linguistic extraction erases the very causes, historical and ongoing, of language endangerment. And in the context of seemingly transparent numbers outlining the crisis or epidemic as it's often framed, and a sudden, if dehistoricized valuing of indigenous languages by a global public, readers are left with a looming question: why? Omitting these factors from discussions of language endangerment leaves out a critical piece of the equation and contributes to the larger pattern of the erasure of settler colonialism. This omission is particularly problematic when such forces are still actively at work. This omission is, here, linguistic extraction is the gateway rhetorical process to the erasure of colonial agency and the misattribution of agency onto indigenous language communities for their own linguistic demise. So while the role and agency of colonial powers is erased, the assignment of agency is not absent from media discussions of language endangerment. In fact, the blame for the plight of indigenous languages is often ascribed to the communities themselves or individuals within them. In the same National Geographic article, whose title brings to mind a competition for fun or sport towards language dormancy, linguists working in the area of language documentation are quoted describing the context in which the language shift occurs. And here are a number of examples. So in these statements, communities decide their languages are somehow impediments, causing them to simply abandon them. The placing of agency on children here in the last two examples is particularly problematic when we consider that children are often the primary targets of linguistic violence and regimes of cultural genocide, while simultaneously having the least power within the sociocultural language dynamics in which they are represented as casually making such choices. Children aren't the only people within indigenous communities called out as the agents of language loss in the media. In the media, in communities where endangered languages are spoken fluently by only a small group of people, individuals are often identified as the cause of the decline of language transmission. Perhaps the most widely discussed example of this is the partially fictionalized story of two speakers of Ayapaneco in Mexico. In a 2011 Huffington Post article about the now infamous feud between two men, Manuel Segovia and Isidro Velázquez, the author summarizes the situation in the following excerpt. Though the language has been spoken in what is now Mexico for centuries, there are only two people left who can speak Ayapaneco fluently. Like so many other indigenous languages, it's at risk of extinction. Even more so, as The Guardian reports, the last two speakers are refusing to talk to each other. Within this widely circulated and reworked story, the two fluent speakers of Ayapaneco are repeatedly identified as the reason Ayapaneco won't be spoken by future generations. Phrases like, it's at risk of extinction because the last two speakers are refusing to talk to each other, directly links language dormancy, here problematically called extinction, to the very latent life actions of two individuals whose personal feelings towards each other are of no consequence to a world desperate to extract that valuable knowledge hidden within the treasure chest of indigenous languages. From this external evaluative perspective, indigenous people owe it to the rest of the world not only to provide aspects of our culture, life, and epistemologies to outsiders on demand, but also to be friends with anyone else involved in accommodating those demands. Such articles are never lamenting the decline or demise of indigenous sovereignty or autonomy, the loss of political, economic, or geographic stability and power, or even the strong correspondence of language attrition with the actual necropolitical dynamics in marginalized communities. In fact, indigenous death, language, or otherwise, is only noteworthy when it's the last. Manuel Segovia and Isidro Velázquez are all part of an increasingly publicly circulating discourse about last speakers of indigenous and endangered languages. Of the rhetorical strategy in news media discussed in this tonight, lasting, as identified by Jeannie O'Brien as a discursive process through which indigenous populations were framed within local New England histories as vanishing, may be the most prevalent. The reporting of last speakers of endangered languages thus represents a multi-centuries old genre of counting down the inevitable end of indigenous people, assuming the unavoidable loss of culture, space, and eventually existence. Take the first words of Judith Thurman's 2015 New Yorker's article titled "A Loss for Words, Can Dying Languages Be Saved?" which opens, "It is a singular fate to be the last of one's kind." Now, importantly here, these are individuals, just one representative of individuals from their communities, and only one type of speaker. But like the individuals identified in O'Brien's work, they are held up as the last of their communities. Such rhetoric directly mirrors 17th century descriptions of the last of tribes in New England, as well as widely popular accounts of the last of the Mohicans, or Ishi the last of the Yahi, and so on, where specific individuals, historical or fictional, are held up as the last of their communities, thereby marking the extinction or vanishing of specific groups of Indians and all Native Americans more generally. This popularity is still evident. There's my missing slide. All right. This popularity is also evident in a National Geographic webpage that invites readers to see and hear last speakers of dying languages. Wikipedia's last list of 59 individuals from around the globe in their article titled "List of Last Known Speakers of Languages." And as previously mentioned, the previously mentioned story from 2012, most frequently titled "The Last Two Speakers of Dying Languages Refusing to Talk to Each Other," among many, many others. As you can tell, this is the end product of me getting angry regularly at the things circulating on Facebook. So if linguistic sovereignty can, at least partially, be understood as that which sits in opposition to these settler colonial narratives of language endangerment, and these narratives of language endangerment through linguistic extraction, the erasure of colonial agency, and lasting, then perhaps the definition of linguistic sovereignty should be understood first and foremost as something inherently embedded in Indigenous communities, histories, spaces, and bodies, rather than extracted from them. Something that does not occur within socio-political vacuums, and because of that, may not be interchangeable across different communities. Something that is future-facing, rather than inevitably racing towards the past. And perhaps most importantly, something which upsets the sensibilities of National Geographic and Huffington Post readers. As such, rather than knowing it when we see it, it may perhaps be better to identify linguistic sovereignty as it is enacted by and between Indigenous individuals, kinship networks, communities, and nations.
And now we'll have Dr. Kauanui.
Greetings, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. This is my first time in this university, and it's also, I haven't been to Chicago in 10 years, so it's a special trip for a lot of reasons, and I'm really excited to meet people who are here, to see old friends, and to connect with people in the audience and with the discussion afterward, and also to be next to these two esteemed ones. I want to echo my gratitude and acknowledgement for the Indigenous peoples of this land that Alyssa mentioned in the welcome, and to acknowledge the Council of the Three Fires, specifically the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Onak, as well as all the other peoples in this crossroads region, as I understand it. Thanks to all the organizers, coordinators, and co-sponsors, and my hosts. I do appreciate the invitation. So, in addition to the framework of security, we were asked to answer that question of what does sovereignty look like in the context of your current project. And I'll say I'm fudging it a bit, but the book's only been out for about 3 weeks, so I'm going to tell you a bit about it. But also, hopefully in the Q&A, draw out the predicaments of these paradoxes that I've been tracing in my work for a long time now. Scholars within Native American and Indigenous studies robustly debate the concept of sovereignty. Some suggest it be abandoned altogether due to its Western roots, while others suggest that the term has gone from describing that singular supreme power over a body politic to a more porous term given its changing meanings and deployments within Indigenous contexts. Still, others caution that rather than discarding the term or concept, we need to theorize Indigenous sovereignties, plural, and how they are distinctly different from the Western concept of sovereignty. How we define sovereignty entails competing epistemological frames and thus different ontological orientations, and therefore diverse forms of theorizing our political present. In the Hawaiian context, those who identify with the contemporary sovereignty movement will find themselves having to distinguish their political orientation from a range of projects. For example, sovereignty speaks to kingdom nationalists who advocate for U.S. de-occupation of Hawaii as an independent state under international law. But sovereignty also resonates for those who support federal recognition of a Native Hawaiian governing entity subject to the strictures of U.S. domestic law regarding tribal nations. Then there are those who use sovereignty as a gloss for the indigenous concept of ea, the Hawaiian term for a vast power and life force binding the interconnectedness between and among our deities, ancestral forces, humans and other animals, all elements of the natural world. While also related to governance, ea is distinctly different from Western sovereignty. In my newly released book, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism, I advance a critical study of contemporary state-centered nationalism and its attendant disavowal of indigeneity. The project offers a genealogical focus on mid-19th century Hawaiian social changes concerning land tenure, as well as gender roles and relations, and sexual norms and practices. I analyzed the epistemological and ontological shift that correlates to the transformation of indigenous Kanaka sovereignty, ea, to the westernized Hawaiian kingdom. From 1795 to 1810, Chief Kamehameha violently converted a Hawaiian society of multiple paramount chiefs into a monarchy. Although initially modeled after the British, the Hawaiian kingdom had strong indigenous elements from the start, but by the 1840s became increasingly westernized. In order to gain access into the European family of nations, it was important that the kingdom presented itself as Christian and male. This was possible because the American Board of Commission of Foreign Missions, also known as the ABCFM, initiated conversion through the first Christian mission to Hawaii in 1820, just 10 years after the founding of the kingdom. Focusing on the racial politics of modernity, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty examines the implications of 19th century indigenous elites' use of a Western model to form a state in order to shield against Western encroachment. Kanaka Maoli, that is indigenous Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli elites, with the assistance of missionaries fighting to stop Western imperialism, worked to reorganize indigenous lifeways to ensure the well-being and very survival of the social body by a protective state. Focusing specifically on the privatization of land along with the imposition of degraded gender status for women across genealogical rank and new confining sexual norms for Kanaka Maoli, I argue that this radical restructuring of Hawaiian society constituted a form of colonial biopolitics linked to the regulatory power of the early nascent Hawaiian state. This reorganization of social forms was a strategy to fight Western racism, yet it necessitated a transformation of the indigenous polity to secure some racial respectability, and thus entailed degrading the so-called savage. In the Hawaiian case, what distinguishes biopolitics from the monarchical right to kill is that the chief's constitutional developments and property initiatives were justified in terms of protecting Hawaiian sovereignty and promoting the welfare of the people. The book also examines the effects of Christianization and the introduction of the Anglo-American legal system in relation to land, gender, and sexuality for contemporary Hawaiian sovereignty politics. I show how, in mobilizing available categories for acknowledging Kanaka distinctiveness, white American notions of property, state sovereignty, and normative gender relations and sexuality become intimately imbricated in aspirations for Hawaiian liberation, hence the paradoxes of Hawaiian sovereignty. In the contemporary nationalist context, activists positing the Hawaiian kingdom as simply needing to be restored through de-occupation end up demeaning, and actively do so in their political discourse, demeaning Hawaiian indigeneity as well as the indigeneity of other indigenous peoples, and deny both U.S. settler colonialism and colonialism writ large. So here there's a complete, there's a linking between saying we're not indigenous because people understand indigenous as a politically subordinate category, which is true, right? Under international law, indigenous peoples have fewer rights than states. and indigenous peoples have fewer rights under federal law. So that part's true, but it ends up being a denial of colonialism as though that's an admission of that subordination in this assertion of a state of sovereignty, kind of the resurrection of the kingdom, if you will. And so there's a denial of settler colonialism by fixating on the fact that Hawaiians had an independent state and saying if you touch anything, maybe look after the 1893 US-backed overthrow, but even that, we're just merely occupied. So I'm looking at sort of these really, the way that these narrow militaristic legal frameworks get used to kind of truncate the broader examination of US settler colonialism as a social formation, but also coloniality and the fact that the very field of coloniality and imperialism that created the kingdom in the first place. And what I talk about is sort of a colonialism by proxy. So you have elites doing kind of an internal job that ends up, you know, being what one could imagine the British or American government doing in the early 19th century. However, kingdom nationalist rejection of indigeneity in the present is also a response to the settler state pushing for federal recognition of a Native Hawaiian governing entity. Again, this is a state-driven process and project, and that's unlike, say, where I'm living in New England, where efforts for federal recognition spring from the grassroots and state officials stand in those tribes' way. In the Hawaiian context, this is being driven for the last 15 years by state officials, so it's a huge red flag. I could signal what I think is going on there in the Q&A if there's time and interest. So this pushback is also due to a real politic, right, of trying to reject this US federal model to contain the Hawaiian sovereignty claim that exceeds federal policy. But this logic continues the assertion of an implicit civilizational imperative and replays the legacy of seeking to disown aspects of Hawaiian history, culture, and an identity deemed heathen in order to assert a properly heteropatriarchal nation state. The main intervention of this work is with respect to rethinking the status of the Hawaiian kingdom and indigeneity for envisioning Hawaiian decolonization, liberation, and self-determination. Thus, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty revisits Michel Foucault's call to find alternatives to the juridical model of sovereignty as a prerequisite for decolonial imaginings of the future. Indigenous resurgence for a more ethical world without non-consensual domination. I argue that it is imperative to reconsider Hawaiian indigeneity as an epistemological resource for rethinking land, gender, sexuality, and the very concept of sovereignty. In other words, I look to indigenous values that are not premised on capitalist exploitation, destructive land tenure practices, gender supremacy of any kind, or sexual subordination, and do so in order to suggest a new ethics of relationality, or relationally are life-sustaining. In closing, I want to just touch upon the theme of security within this discussion of sovereignty. The question of Hawaiian sovereignty is always already tied up with U.S. notions of security and military domination in much of the same ways that you highlighted in your introduction. This is clear from naysayers who insist that Hawaii could never be independent because it needs U.S. military protection for its security, right? If Hawaii hadn't taken it, somebody else would have, right? This is the narrative that we're inundated with constantly, either to justify the past or to try and preempt imagining a different future. And yet it is clear that the U.S. government needs Hawaii, not the other way around. Honolulu is the base for the U.S. Pacific Command, which has an area of responsibility that encompasses half the world's surface. This includes 36 nations that are collectively home to more than 50% of the world's population and 3,000 different languages. According to the 2015 Department of Defense's Base Structure Report, the military has at least 142 known sites in Hawaii alone. But there is also the crucial and urgent labor of a network called DMZ Hawaii Aloha Aina, focused on demilitarization through research, action, and solidarity to counter the military's negative social, cultural, and environmental impact in Hawaii. The name of the network derives from the acronym DMZ for Demilitarized Zone, to describe the spaces that have been reclaimed and liberated from militarization. And Aloha Aina highlights the commitment to the Hawaiian principle of love and stewardship of the land. And so that's all I have to read, but I did want to just do a couple quick bullet points of things that I might be able to bring to the discussion during our crosstalk and also the Q&A. I want to acknowledge Dean Serenilio's book, hot off the press. I just got it in the mail 2 days ago. It's called Unsustainable Empire, Alternative Histories of Hawaii Statehood. And in it, he interrogates the notion of Hawaii as the 50th State of the Union being an issue that's permanently settled. and talks about unsustainable empire and the fact that it's when the US set out for empire in the Pacific, and we can see this in the Caribbean too, it's precisely because the US was broken economically. So he really flips the kind of hegemonic viewpoint that these sovereignty and national struggles or these islands are weak, right? But he also doesn't exceptionalize Hawaii, he links it to continental indigenous struggles. And so I think one of the things here is that his work is exposing a deep contradiction, right? That US empire and settler colonialism emerged from weakness, not strength, what we might call insecurity. And he talks about the US failing forward. And so that's something that we could talk more about. I read the book at the earliest stages, and so I have a sense of that and can share some of his exciting work. And also wanted to highlight the works, respective works of both Patrick Wolk and Aileen Morton Robinson, who talk about settler anxiety and that persistence of indigenous sovereignty that always already lends to a kind of questioning of security for the settler society. And they both are writing about the Australian context when they theorize that, but certainly there's work that we can be thinking about here. And I think you mentioned border crossing and border patrol, and I think that whole idea of highlighting what does it mean to bring indigeneity as a category of analysis to what's going on in the media now, not just in the rare recognition that these are mostly indigenous migrants coming from Central America and those from Mexico, but also thinking about what it means to highlight the nativism that's at work right now and that settler colonial taking of people trying to talk about protecting the border as though they own the place. Thank you so much.
Last but not least, our very own
And last line, protecting the border is a day on the list. Re-emphasize that. Thank you everybody for coming. It's great to see old friends, new faces, and thank you to everyone for organizing, to Bonnie and Alyssa for CNAS bringing things together. Folks at CNAR who do amazing things, and Kaplan who are always putting on these cool programs. So thank you to all to bring this all together. Before I get into talking a little bit about my own work and how these questions of sovereignty and security are very much wrapped up in the nature of things that are happening in Oneida, Wisconsin that I'm writing about, I just wanted to start with a few sort of broader conceptual contributions to the conversation that maybe we can come back to. And some of it comes from teaching a bit, how to frame how we engage in these discussions. First off, I mean, there's so many examples of indigenous struggles that are that resonate with these questions of security. But there's a couple of things that come to mind additionally in the present that that we can read about today, where I think it's very much about security. One of those is what's happening with Mashpee Wampanoag people, who are the native people who are there to greet pilgrims upon their arrival, right? And they're not recognized by the federal government until 2007. There's a long story that that talks that we can get into about indigeneity in New England and why that's the case. And there's been some great work done on it. But in the present, they have been promised that lands would be converted into trust as in official reservation land for them, 321 acres. The Obama administration promised this. The Trump administration, through the Department of the Interior, has reversed its decision, right? And so what Mashpee people are seeking through that, right, is a sense of security into the centuries ahead in terms of reestablishing some sort of land base, right? This is a community that only just recently gained federal recognition, and now it's trying to grasp at something to establish a permanent land base that can be secure for the long-term future, right? And this is the kind of problem that they're running into. Elsewhere, I mean, again, these sorts of struggles are everywhere, but elsewhere I'm thinking about the encampment of hundreds of homeless Native people in Minneapolis, right? And the ways in which their own encampment there, which is, they call themselves the Wall of Forgotten Natives, right, is a sovereignty movement that is also about their own security in so many different kinds of ways, right? Security in the sense of housing security, right, in terms of being serviced, decently by the city of Minneapolis and by the state of Minnesota, the federal government. Security in that sort of vein, but also through themselves, through each other, right? Why an encampment, right? And when one digs into the stories that come from people at the encampment, as I've been following some of the coverage of it lately, a lot about it is people banding together, right? Because the city shelter system has been failing them, right? And so, you know, the idea was let's you know, establish some sort of you know, native space just near the native neighborhood in Minneapolis, and you know, and state their case for, you know, demanding better quality services and a better quality of life from the city around them, right? That enjoys one of the greatest standards of living in the world, right? On the basis of stolen Ojibwe and Dakota land. And so that's another way in which some of these struggles and the ways in which it intersects with questions of security, I think, are so present. I want to draw attention to the ways in which the language of sovereignty is not just familiar to us in Indigenous studies, but it's also the language of Indigenous sovereignty is something that the United States likes to use, even though it does so often really badly, right? For those of us who are in the field, I could play the clip that has now become famous and popular, that some people already know what I'm talking about, right? For those who are unfamiliar, you can just Google the George W. Bush and sovereignty and witness what was a profoundly bumbling attempt to answer a basic question in 2004 about what does tribal sovereignty mean to you, right? And one could witness a head of state, right, of a colonial society fumble to articulate what in the world sovereignty is, other than using the word sovereignty 6 times to explain it, right? That sovereignty is sovereignty, you have it, you've been given it, no, it doesn't work that way even. And so, but what I find interesting about that, you know, for more than just the chuckles, which is, why do they engage with that language when they clearly don't really understand what it means, in the sense that of what it means to Indigenous people, right? And I think there's something tricky going on there, right? And I think there's something about it that feels to me a bit like projects that are framed in multiculturalist or sort of diversity kind of ways, right? Which is to say, we get it, you have certain special rights and autonomy, we recognize that, you have that. That thing you call sovereignty, we acknowledge that, right? But no, not really. It's an incredibly limited and conditional political status. But I do find it's useful to think about, why does the United States so readily use a set of language that it's not actually committed to, right? That it invites Native people to places like the White House to engage in conversation, and uses the word sovereign to describe people who are clearly identifiable as continuing to be colonial subjects. Why do they do that? And I think there's something really interesting in that. And in so many ways, you know, I think we can go to those questions of, you know, the ways in which it, you know, certainly doesn't fit for Indigenous intellectual histories, right? And there's been arguments, you know, particularly by Kēhaulani Kauanui about, you know, potentially moving beyond those kinds of conceptions. And I think in other ways, though, it's interesting to think the ways in which sovereignty has also been used as a weapon against us as Indigenous people, right? And so there's a sense of responding to the United States and its own claims of sovereignty by saying, no, that thing you're bulldozing over us with, we have that too, right? A claim to sovereignty that way. I think, you know, to flag some of my favorite stuff on sovereignty is Kēhaulani and the Hawaiian blood, of course. And I'm also thinking, I love Jessica Catalino's article, The Double Bind of American Indian Need-Based Sovereignty. It's one of my favorite go-to pieces for thinking about all of the ways in which sovereignty can sometimes be framed as something, nobody quite puts it this way, but I mean, it becomes categorized in much the same way that a welfare program would, right? And that it's effectively, when she talks about its contingency in terms of need-based, that is to say that wealthy communities that have resources to govern themselves, because you need resources to govern yourselves, right, and to have an actual functioning government, that having the resources to actually run a functioning government then opens up a set of questions about the inauthenticity of that group of Native people, right? They become too wealthy, they don't need sovereignty any longer, right? If we're really talking about sovereignty, it's not going to be conditional, right? It's not flexible. And so that's another thing that's going on, right? We can identify these moments in which we can see it flexible in that way. There's a really powerful quote that she pulls from Skip Hayward, former chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Nation, when he says, quote, maybe if we were still getting water from an open well and going outside the two-hole outhouses and using human manure to fertilize our gardens, nobody would be paying any attention to us. But now we're coming back to be leaders again. Now there seems to be a problem. So the actual enactment of sovereignty, right, and in a way that's identifiable, in a way in which non-Indigenous neighbors can feel the presence of a tribal government, provokes problems, right? And that's a lot about what some of what my work is about in the book I'm working on. And there's a lot of faith, I think, in certain ways, in territorial notions of sovereignty that I think are important to think about, but not entirely abandoned. And that is to say, what I'm writing about is a century-long process of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin trying to piece back the reservation together, right, after allotment, right, after losing the 65,000 acre whole, shrinks down to about 100, 200 acres of lands that are still held in reservation trust, right? And it's a story of piecing together the reservation again, right? And the sense of, with every acre that goes back into official reservation status, right, it's protected, secure, it's safe. It's going to be there for generations, right? And so that becomes the predominant goal. This is the thing that we need to do, is to piece everything back together again. And once it's done, what, right? And those are the kinds of questions that I want to engage, dealing with the structural precarity of the reality that what it is a project to put back in place what was disrupted from trust status, right? And so we know through history that trust status is not permanent, right? It's the most permanent thing, in quotes, that we have, but it's certainly not permanent in itself, right? And so I think we inevitably confront those kinds of limitations. I think there's a lot of ways in which sometimes, as we think about rebuilding projects, you know, I guess I would sort of back up a little bit and frame this as, because I'm certainly in favor of rebuilding projects, that's what I'm writing about, but I want to think about the ways in which, you know, they have their limitations. And again, one of them is the ways in which we could maybe convince ourselves in which greater economic resources alone, right, translates to greater indigenous power. In some ways that translates into greater conflict because Native people have more power than their neighbors. But really to ask these core questions about justice as well and security. Right? Oneidas are people whose homeland is 1,000 miles away in upstate New York, as Haudenosaunee people. Most of my family, including my own grandmother, never set foot in the ancestral Oneida homelands, and that's the experience of most people. And so that's to say, is the idea that many in the Oneida Nation now enjoy a middle-class lifestyle, vastly different than a century ago, and that we have much more land back in tribal land holdings, right? And maybe some people have a new car. Oh, they go to Walmart. Are these things supposed to be adequate compensation for being exiled from one's homeland for the last 2 centuries, and more than likely in perpetuity? No, not at all. But I think there's a way in which those kinds of, in which the socioeconomic needle moves, right? I think there's a lot of ways in which we're encouraged to accept that really is a form of security that we can rely on, right? And I'm a little bit worried about that in that sense. In terms of other ways in which there's limitations, a great case for reminding ourselves of that is the 2005 City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation case, which is out of actually Oneida, New York. And that's over a question, for the very first time the Supreme Court has to grapple with this question of, so what happens when tribes can buy back land? The Supreme Court has to figure that out in 2005, right? That's not the direction of Native history typically, right? And so suddenly Native communities, often with the help of casino resources, are now in a position to buy back vast swaths of territory and place them back into trust and reestablish territorial nationhood in that sense, right? The Supreme Court has to figure out, so can Oneida people in New York just start buying up whatever they would like in New York, all over central New York, under the sort of paradigm that it's within their ancestral territory, right? And the Supreme Court quickly puts the brakes on that and says, no, it's not going to work that way. You can't just buy a block of Syracuse and say that, that it belongs to the nation again, right? You're going to have to buy what's within the boundaries of your most recently agreed upon treaty, right? Within that zone, that's what you can reclaim, right? And so again, that puts a limitation upon, it puts a clear ceiling on how far it is that projects of indigenous rebuilding are allowed to go, right? And I think that's important to be aware of. And in so many ways, if we were to actually see the United States or Canada or any other settler state for that matter, fully acknowledge indigenous sovereignty, that would be something that requires far more than lip service, but actual constitutional transformation, right? If we're to think about, in so many ways, calls for doing so are typically by the courts often labeled too disruptive, right? One of the reasons why, for instance, in terms of Oneida's won a 1985 Supreme Court case that says 250,000 acres of upstate New York was wrongfully taken from the Oneida Nation up to the state of New York and the Oneida Nation to come to some sort of agreement. That's taking a while. And in so many ways, what the court often falls back on is to say that it would be too disruptive. It would be too disruptive to actually restructure how American society works. It would be too disruptive to redistribute power, right? It's much easier to speak in terms of inclusion, the language of inclusion, than it is to actually talk about systemic problems. Right? And the principle of plenary power, just to put that on the table, as we move forward. I find that it's really difficult to engage in questions of sovereignty without thinking about one of its most powerful limitations, which is, in terms of U.S. law, a series of Supreme Court cases, which I won't go into the details of, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, arrived at a conclusion in Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock by 1903, that effectively the U.S. Congress has the authority, if it so wishes, to nullify a treaty, if that's what it wants to do, right? And so it destabilizes the whole principle of what a treaty is supposed to be, right? And not just for Native people, but again, thinking about the ways in which I think this is a crucial part of Indigenous sovereignty, because that's tied to the United States, right? It's in the U.S. Constitution. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. The United States uses Indigenous sovereignty in that sense to establish itself, right? Treaties with Indigenous people help establish the sense that the United States itself is sovereign, right? And in 1903, the Supreme Court decides, well, if the United States decides, the U.S. Congress decides, it may nullify unilaterally a treaty, right? And so that asks, begs the question of, well, what are these things, right? Again, why do we use this language? Why would we use sovereign to describe that, right? And I want to just really a couple quick thoughts that we can potentially discuss. Getting to the UN Declaration, there's, thinking about sovereignty and security. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, at least in my sense, and maybe we can debate it a little bit, it has far more to do, not with Indigenous sovereignty, but with state sovereignty. It's entirely about state sovereignty, because at the end, I'll read the final closing note. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the UN or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Right? So you can have Indigenous rights just as long as they don't disrupt territorial integrity of colonizing nations. Well, how is that going to happen, right? And lastly, just as a quick note, I think ultimately what sovereignty is about is it's a concept of futurity, in the sense that it is it is a sense of having the space to actually envision and carry out our own futures as we might imagine them, right? And that's so much that we think of what's taken from Native people throughout Indigenous history is the capability of building our own futures. And sovereignty, I think, is a beautiful concept for how we create these new future worlds for Indigenous people.
Thank you so much to our presenters for those amazing talks. It's really exciting to see how the questions regarding sovereignty can be approached in so many different ways and lead to so many different conversations. So, in light of that, the four of us are now going to spend, I think, about 20 to 25 minutes so that we still have time for audience questions, discussing various threads that we want to pursue further. And as I said before, it will be a good solid 15 at least minutes for audience questions. So let's get started. I'll start us off. So while all of your presentations were very different from each other, something I saw threading through them all were questions of how sovereignty is recognised and who gets to recognise, and how sovereignty is defined and who gets to define it. I think you all, Dr. Davis, you started us off on that note, and Dr. Kiel, with your questions about the language of sovereignty and how it's also being used problematically and used against Indigenous nations, come to mind immediately. So can you each say a bit more about questions of recognition and definition that come up in your work, and if sovereignty as a concept is so often limited by the constraints of set definitions, then is it really the most useful concept to think of in these situations?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the things that I'm very interested in, because there are a lot of moments where, in fact, language comes into, and linguistic sovereignty, right, is a component of other types of sovereignty, and is often inherently tied into it. And in fact, the ideas of what the centrality of language may be in defining a community and defining whether or not it's still a community and still counts, right? So the it's, some of it's economic, some of it's cultural. So you have groups who are in fact, whose tries for recognition at state or federal levels are denied because there are no more speakers or because they don't have the indigenous language place names that are still in place, right? So there's a process in which the documentation required hinges upon ideas of what language is, of what it should be, of who should speak it, and whether it should still be spoken. And so that's a really inherent part of how people are having to navigate sovereignty, what types of things they have access to, and in fact is a way of often of undermining whether or not people should be recognized as sovereign people. And in fact, the undermining and laying claim to languages, I think, is an inherent part of the process of undermining and laying claims to indigenous knowledge of lands, right? So if the world has a right to have access to or document indigenous languages, that's also a way of claiming a right to be in a space to document those languages, to have access to the knowledge within them, to have access to people. And so I think that those discourses that are really widely circulating where people are saying, it's the world should care about this because the world should care that there's so much knowledge held within these languages, right? That these are important epistemological systems, but at the same time they're saying, and because it's important to the world, we have the right to have access to it. In fact, so you get people who are in fact incensed and angry that tribes will not, or any indigenous community, might not allow someone to come in and document it, right? Or that they don't want it to circulate outside of community or certain parameters, or even certain practices, right? So I think that there are ways in which language, because it's often treated as a neutral thing, even though it's used as a weapon, it's used as any number of different things, that those discourses are actually laying the groundwork for a lot of other ways that attack the security, right, and the sovereignty of individuals and communities to say no, to say we want to decide how things circulate. You guys?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So just picking up on that last part of your question around sovereignty so limited by constraints, is it perhaps the most useful, or how to think about it is still worthwhile as a concept? This is something I think about a lot in terms of, why even use the S word for something like Ea, or to gloss Ea as indigenous sovereignty. And I think for me, it's in thinking through Hawaiian studying and being a participant in the Hawaiian nationalist movement since 1990, that I'm just not willing to relinquish the S word, precisely because that's where the states would be very happy to see that. And that to me is about waging battle around legal claims. Even if I don't see the law as the answer, it's a tactical way to sort of highlight that, and not to say that the law is the same as sovereignty, but to really think about Ea is still tied to governance, and it's still tied to land, even if that land in that most capacious sense isn't territory, even though we might think of governance and territoriality. And so because it's still tied to the collective polity, I think it's still a useful term, but with all these kind of qualifications, right? And this kind of careful way of framing it. And I think about that in relation, just to go with the law for a minute, because I am really interested in anti-statist and non-statist solutions to this. And that comes out of, you heard of the mention of the public affairs show Indigenous Politics. I've been working on anarchist radio with a collective, a majority POC show with a group of Wesleyan students. We had one version of it for 3 years called Horizontal Power Hour, and then a lot of the students, they were very cohesive and they graduated, and we had trouble kind of like turning over. And there was like a year lull, and then I rebooted with one of those people who was still there. And now we have Anarchy on Air, which has been going since 2014. And I mention that because for me, this is where things come together in terms of thinking about, a world that isn't premised on non-consensual domination and anti-statist solutions. But people will say, well, how does that jive with this indigenous sovereignty stuff you do, or Hawaiian nationalism, and this work on federal law or international law? And I'll just use the example with international law for Hawaii. don't think international law is the solution. International law is part of the problem, and that we know the roots of international law were about the imperial powers creating their own laws to sort out their own beefs with each other about what they could have in the world. And then also we know from the work of like Stephen Newcomb and other indigenous legal scholars that international law is steeped in Christian medieval law when it comes to indigenous peoples, because it still codifies, enshrines, and operates the doctrine of discovery, which goes back to the papal bulls, just as U.S. federal policy does. So as he points out, the notion in the U.S. for Johnson v. McIntosh that there's a separation of church and state is a farce. We can say the same thing about international law that purports to be secular, not when it comes to indigenous peoples. We're still in the Christian medieval period. So, but that doesn't mean that I'm not willing to cite international law every day, all day when it comes to the U.S. illegal overthrow of Marines that backed 13 white settlers that overthrew Queen Kēhaulani in 1893. The unilateral annexation of Hawaii in 1898 through a joint resolution of Congress, not even through an act of Congress, which would be a violation of international law. There's no treaty. And then the 1959 50th statehood, which is on, months before the 1960 decolonization protocols of the United Nations. And so for me, that's about highlighting U.S. illegality. It's a leverage point. It's a way to mobilize. It's a way to educate. And so I feel like for sovereignty, just to get back to the core of the question, that important part is to not ditch it when it's part of the battleground right now.
One thing I would want to add differently, because I don't want to just cover a lot of the stuff that these great comments have already gone through. I'm thinking of one thing in terms of the recognition aspect, in terms of the political process. And if you're interested, I mentioned before, thinking about these recognition issues in places like New England, there's a great book, also involves Jeannie O'Brien again. Jeannie O'Brien and Amy Denoden, Recognition, Sovereignty Struggles, and Indigenous Rights in the U.S., a source book. And it's really great for taking a look at the history of the process of what it is for tribes to become recognized as federally recognized tribes. And there's one particular aspect of it that I think is really tricky. As Bonnie asked, who gets to recognize it and how. So much of what is part of that process of tribal recognition is questions of continuity, which is one of the most difficult things to be able to demonstrate in light of the history of colonialism. And by histories of continuity, by that I mean, well, the one example I gave in regards to Mashpee Wampanoags, right? I mean, part of what has become complicated is a little bit of an arcane legal text that refers to tribes that are recognized before and after 1934, for instance. And these questions of continuity, right, they often, for instance, Mashpee Wampanoags, one of the reasons that they would have such a difficult time over the course of decades, centuries, gaining recognition is because of a difficulty of being able to identify a continuous community with continuous governance and within a bounded geography and so on and so forth, right? All of the aspects of Western nationhood that are legible to the United States. This is what a nation is supposed to look like. You don't look like that, right? And of course, that's not really the case. There are important forms of continuity that endure, but even despite that, right, sort of punishing indigenous people for effectively having been subject to the processes of colonialism that are designed explicitly to disrupt the continuity of indigenous people. So that's to say, well, you haven't maintained your own government in a continuous way over the last 2 centuries. Thus, we can't necessarily validate this claim. And so those issues of continuity, I think, really come up a lot because it's one of the most difficult aspects of the recognition process, and that's because it's dealing directly with the problems of the disruption of communities itself. The colonial policies themselves are about.
So nationalist movements, issues of governance and land rights cases seem to be quite overt ways of articulating and pushing for very particular kinds of sovereignty, or whatever we would like to call it. But as your presentations showed, sovereignty can also concern things we might not always think about when we think about sovereignty. For example, language revitalization, different ways to understand and talk about gender and sexuality. I'm also thinking here of food sovereignty, control over education, etc. So I'd like to invite you all to talk a bit more about these perhaps less obvious, for lack of a better term, modes of striving for Indigenous sovereignty and their roles in Indigenous nation building.
Say that last part again, please, Bonnie.
So, just would like to hear more about these less obvious modes of striving for Indigenous sovereignty and their roles in Indigenous nation building.
One quick example.
Yep.
I'll refer back to the trip that Patty and I just took to Oneida Nation, and I know you take pretty regularly to participate in, and Beaton's there too, in terms of participating in community harvest of traditional Oneida white corn, right? I think, you know, what's important about it, right, which is, you know, maybe in certain ways not a, to take part in that day isn't an explicitly political act. I mean, you know, certainly in so many ways it is, right? But I mean, you know, it's a community gathering. People are hanging out, people are eating, people are drinking cider and, you know, and picking and chucking corn, right? It's a very social kind of day, right? People are spending time together, laughing, telling jokes, and maybe it's not the sort of thing that we first think of when we evoke the language of sovereignty, right? We maybe think of some sort of occupation, some sort of group demonstration, right? But I mean, that's an important form of community life that is every day, that I think is very much steeped in what it is to be sovereign, right? To just be indigenous in one's own land and live according to one's own logics, right?
Okay, great. Well, I'll just mention a couple examples around gender and sexuality, and thinking about, again, and in the book I look at land, gender, and sexuality and the relationship and this emergence of proprietary regimes, and how the privatization of land in Hawaii is happening at the same time you have marriage as a colonial imposition, and at the same time where any kind of sexual practices outside of a dyadic male-female Christianized marriage is not only illegal, but is actually prosecuted. Right? You have missionaries who say the roads in Hawaii were built on adultery. So you think about the modernization coming out of that, and politics of penality and incarceration and forced labor. I mean, that's all tied up with the regulation of Hawaiian sexuality. And so when I say, like, drawing on Hawaiian lifeways, indigenous lifeways as epistemological resources, two examples around this that I could offer up would be the concept of the punalua, which means two heads, and it basically, or there's po'olua, excuse me, there's punalua too, which has to do with multiple partnerships and multiple intimacies, and I'm very interested in that for all kinds of reasons, and that's because, you know, I'm a marriage abolitionist, and I, you know, really am looking at this kind of politics of how does marriage come to be normalized in Hawaii. And so much of it is based on the regulation of Hawaiian women's sexuality when you have competing imperialist forces wanting access to Hawaiian women, Hawaiian commoner women. And so there's that. But so po'olua is two heads, punalua is a different kind of duplicity. Or not duplicity, duality? No. Could involve that, but not necessarily. Definitely not. Consensual. But the idea of, like, there's that, the two heads though is that if a woman has had a child in a pre-colonial, and for Hawaii pre-colonial we're talking the late 18th century, so I'm not having to go back to the 1400s, for example, so there's a lot of retrievable examples. If a woman had a child and there were two possible fathers, right, think about this in contrast with the Western system of patrilineality. Both men would be responsible for the offspring, and their families, their extended kin, that child could draw on the resources and genealogies of both, not either but both. You know, and I'll give that example. People say, well, you don't need that now, you just have DNA testing. It's like, well, the point here is that it gives us a sense of Hawaiian ethics. There's no such thing as an illegitimate child. That's perverse, right? That tells you something about how we think about children, or how we should think about children, or could think about children now, today, in the 21st century, and thinking about that and the insights that example gives. Or the idea around multiple sexual possibilities and intimacies. And, you know, in Hawaii, you had this regiment being imposed in a society where bisexuality seems to have been norm, and not just for the elite chiefs, and also that multiple partners, for lack of a better word, were for all genders, not just men, and that's unusual. And that's also related to the fact that we have a bilateral genealogical system where you can get your genealogy any way you can, right, from your maternal and paternal lines. And so for me, thinking about that in relation to the regulation and imposition and coverture and all the kind of legacy that we're still living with in Hawaii, and that, you know, people say, yeah, but now you've got same-sex marriage, and it's like, great, more of the same. You know, you're just extending this colonial regimen, and what's worse is you've got this, again, state-driven projects mixed with some grassroots efforts, drawing on their notions of pre-colonial Hawaiian society to try and advance a project under an illegal state, settler state, and occupation in Hawaii around inclusion, right? So that liberal aloha and the land for all. And so for me, it's really about a different kind of decolonization. And I guess I just end with one notion when you say about nation building. Again, that can be a red flag for a lot of people in thinking about it. And I guess I would just highlight that for me, the nation building part doesn't have to accompany a state project. And for me, the nation, I mean that in the Hawaiian, I would use that in the Hawaiian sense. We have the word lahui, which means peoplehood. And peoplehood becomes a gloss for nation. But nation doesn't need to, we have a state, we have the Hawaiian Kingdom, we also have the 50th state, the illegal fraudulent state, there's the US state. But that lahui is peoplehood, and for me that distinctiveness of Kanaka, like I said, Kanaka's distinctiveness, is something I'm committed to, otherwise we're talking about something that's genocidal and about the erasure of difference, and I am interested in radical difference.
Great. So I thought of two things inherently of thinking about the less obvious modes of kind of indigenous sovereignty. And so the first one I thought of is the importance of refusal and refusals. So I'm thinking about Audrey Simpson's work, but also that a lot of times the act of refusal, whether it's refusing the nation state, whether it's refusing colonialism, Christianity, right, that's a really central process that happens at the individual level, it happens at the familial level, it happens at depending on how things are organized, right, at clan, but also in the indigenous nation, right? And so there are lots of ways in which communities refuse, and it looks very different. So some people will refuse going up for recognition. Some of them will refuse recognition on certain terms. Individuals will refuse various types of, say, not recognizing people if they aren't, don't have citizenship, right? There are a number of different ways in which I think refusal is a really critical way to think about the ways that sovereignty is enacted, the ways that, especially at multiple levels, and how that works. And then the other area I would say is within my own activism and research within the Two-Spirit movement and urban Indian populations, where the work is multi-tribal, and it is among people from a lot of different communities, a lot of different languages, a lot of different epistemologies. But the idea of the single clean boundary, easily distinguishable, not interacting with any other group, indigenous community, is a construct of colonialism. So communities, we had massive networks of trade and interaction and processes for adoption or capture, depending on, I don't know if I have any Comanches in the room, but, right, so there's lots of interaction, and in fact, interaction between and among communities was the norm. That is an indigenous practice. Multilingualism is an indigenous practice, right? And so thinking about the ways that Two-Spirit societies, which are, and activism is inherently multi-tribal. Now, I'm not saying pan-tribal, right? This is not the case where you just adopt whatever you want and everything's a freebie. But in fact, the norms of how do you interact in a space where you're coming from lots of different communities, what are those rules, what are those expectations, how do you behave when you're in a space that isn't your traditional lands or your current jurisdiction or any number of contexts, right? So I see a lot of that activism as actually speaking to the ways that indigenous people have always been and still are, right? Participating in sovereignties and in fact recognizing the sovereignty of each other, but not in some kind of totally separate, distinct space. And I see that as in itself a refusal of the narrative that we get, of the maps that we get, and the ways that were often constructed. And in fact, the ideas of continuity, the idea that if you have two groups that came together and formed a new group or broke apart, that somehow is a disruption of continuity and is a disruption of what it means to be an indigenous nation, indigenous community. So I see those kinds of multi-tribal activism, I see individual refusals and also tribal refusals as being a really important part of thinking about the kinds of things we want to think about when we're using a term like sovereignty, whether or not that's the best term for it or not.
I'm really glad that all three of you are bringing up continuity, because it leads really nicely to my next question. Dr. Kiel, you've called Indigenous nation building. I took this quote from an email, so it's totally peer-reviewed. But I really liked this definition. So you called Indigenous nation building, quote, movements that are driven to create conditions of long-term security, end quote. So I'm drawn to the expansiveness, but also the concrete nature of this definition. So shifting from, well, still thinking about sovereignty, but thinking about security with that, can we say a bit more about what those conditions of long-term security might look like? And do they sometimes differ from sovereignty, or think about self-determination? Or Dr. Kauanui, you just mentioned that sovereignty might not always have to accompany a state project or something along those lines. So how might we think of, what does continuity look like there?
I suppose I'll start by responding to my own email. I think that's the first time my email's been cited. But yeah, that's a really, that's a great question, for us to collectively think about, because I think it's so particular to individual nations, right? I mean, I feel this way in regards to addressing a lot of the dilemmas of settler colonialism, that ultimately it's for each indigenous community to chart their own path through the mess that colonialism creates, right? And so I wouldn't feel comfortable offering a set of like best practices or something like that, roadmaps and such. But I mean, I've been really interested in the nature of my own work is effectively about listening to those conversations and realizing that they're conversations. Conversations that have taken place over the course of a century and more, right? So in so many ways I'm reading through intellectual histories of how it is Oneida people over the course of generations and how that shifts over time think about what it might possibly be to protect themselves, to create a more secure future. And that may or may not even, at different points in the conversation, may or may not even include their nation, right? Early in the 20th century, it's pretty open-ended, right? I mean, do we attempt to recover the land base, for instance, or do we turn our attention elsewhere? Do we look to reclaiming the lands in New York? And it winds up being a combination of all of these things. But in so many ways, I'm thinking back to a conversation I had with Richard Monette recently, who teaches at University of Wisconsin Law School, former tribal president of Turtle Mountain Nation. And his simple way of putting it is sovereignty is not a thing you have, but is things you do, right? Actions that you take. And thinking about it that way, right? Thinking about a series of, what aren't necessarily always big, right? But I mean, they can be a constellation of smaller actions and smaller moves within communities. So I mean, that's to say, it's sort of like to characterize the nature, I think, of what it is, how people are, grappling with these questions of moving towards security and how it's played out in Oneida. I mean, it's been things like, well, the land base. The land base is potentially a mechanism for security. That's a theory, right? That's the argument. That's the that's the sort of, in a sense, gamble even that the nation is making. That this is going to be a way that that holds secure our future, perhaps and hopefully, right? And and I think elsewhere it's centered on questions of economic development in different forms, right? I mean, nations are having to address really heavy and difficult questions of whether they'll do things like engage in certain kinds of extractive industry within their own indigenous lands. And the ways in which people respond to those possibilities is incredibly wide-ranging, right? And for some, even in ways that if it's not something I would like to see my own nation pursue, but ways I can empathize with, right? To empathize with some of the choices that some communities have to make, which is to say, participating in XYZ form of resources extraction is a form of security, right? That's the argument that they make for themselves and proceed forward. But I think in so many ways, but also feels so structurally problematic, and is so structurally problematic about it is, but is there really choice in that, right? In those kinds of moments. And that's and that's debatable. So, but I mean, I just I feel like these are the things that communities themselves, and debates that that really they require a lot of time and space and energy and effort to map out what these more secure futures might look like. And it's played out so differently, right, in terms of language and culture and economic futures and so on and so forth.
A couple things come to mind in terms of that question. I mean, one is, I want to talk about Hawaii again, but I want to go back to the Mashpee example that Doug talked about in his talk around the land claims and Mashpee being under threat right now, and the switch from the Obama decision to Trump's trying to rescind that. And I mean, just thinking about, I mean, for any anthro student, you would have been taught the Mashpee case probably. It's seen as notorious around the politics of authenticity and ethnicity, because they were denied the recognition of legitimacy of a tribe in the 1970s by a jury trial, right? And that was because they were starting out, as I understand it, to try and protect their land from being developed. And when they tried to press a land claim, they were told, you have to first substantiate that you're an actual tribe. And so that led them down this legal rabbit hole where they basically had to try and convince a jury that they existed at certain points in time, right? And there were these threshold dates across centuries from the arrival of the so-called pilgrims, or pilgrims and others, pilgrims and missionaries, and corporate capitalists, and basically try to do that. And if there wasn't the continuity, right, there was the denial and that whole thing around, well, are you using felt on your gear when you do your social dances versus, something else, like you're using thread, polyester thread, or sinew, these kinds of things. And so to think that we have the BIA Office of the Branch of Acknowledgement and Recognition, which comes out in the aftermath of the Mashpee case and creates this whole threshold of federal recognition, shifting it from the judicial branch of government to the executive. And then you've got a few of the legislative ones with like the Virginia tribes, the Lumbee continuously trying to get federal recognition, and then the state-driven Akaka bill for Hawaiians. And so just to think that right now, like that was the thing that then they got federal recognition in 2007, and now it's back to the land claim again. And this is a first contact tribe, right? This is really on the eastern seaboard. It's one of the first contact tribes. So just thinking about that, and because it does go back to land, and that's I guess where I want to take it for the Hawaii context, and thinking about all the incredible indigenous resurgence that is going on an island. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds, but so like everything from hula resurgence, language revitalization, spiritual practices, traditional medicine, traditional food, but so much is about literally like getting into the kalo, the lo'i kalo, and picking out invasive species and trying to restore watersheds and taro farms, right? Kalo is the Hawaiian word for taro, and that's about feeding people. And it's an indigenous-centered project that's all-inclusive, right? So it's not indigenous only, far from it. How can that work when Kanaka are a minority in their own homeland? The idea is, the Hawaiian ethos, if you feed everybody, right? You feed everybody. And the idea is if you want to help with this project, get into the mud. I'm not in the mud, I'm living in Wankung territory in Middletown, but I want to lift up the work that people are doing on island, which really is about a sustainability, and it's tied to the, trying to counter environmental degradation. What do you do when it's California crabgrass, or the diversion of water to hotel toilets, and earlier than that, like, monocrops like sugarcane, and then you import rice, like white rice, which has like almost no nutritional value, and you're replacing one of the most complex carbohydrates on planet Earth in terms of Hawaiians had all these hybrid versions of kalo. So just thinking about that amazing work and thinking about that kind of sovereignty related to land, foods, environmental sustainability, and that. And then just one last thing. Sorry to eat up the time, but I'd be remiss if I don't mention that the Hawaii Supreme Court finally ruled in a long saga on the TMT case at Mauna Kea, or Sacred Summit, on Moku Okeawe, the Big Island. And I think what you're going to see is a real throwdown. I mean, there's been a lot of protests over this case for years. Some of the most visible came out in April 2014, and then the case, was remanded back, and it's just gone in and out of the courts at every different level. But just a few weeks ago, you had the Hawaii Supreme Court giving a green light for this development for further desecration of yet another massive telescope. And this has, there's so many layers to this. There's burial sites up there, there's traditional medicine, there's the damage to the water aquifers, there's, how many telescopes do you need? That whole question. There's also the Kingdom Crown lands. These are on government lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom. There's so many layers to how you could do that. But I just wanted to bring that up for people to keep their eye on that case, because right now, people back home are saying, like, siwan the mauna, meaning, like, basically people are going to throw their bodies down and try and stop this construction, and I think it's going to be a huge moment. I think it will be, you know, it was in 2014 and they successfully stopped it, but we'll see now with this new ruling.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking of the ways, like in the what sovereignty does for it, and does, and what it might work against us in some ways. And so I was thinking of it also in the ways that the term sovereignty and the concept of sovereignty often works on the ground in our communities, where it's wielded as something that is so fragile that you can't raise trouble, right? You shouldn't be doing anything that puts sovereignty in jeopardy. So if you're doing things within the community, that will often be a thing that's handed down and says, don't cause trouble, don't bring this up right now, this is not the issue, let's focus on something else, or let's not focus on this at all, because if you raise any flags, right, it's anything that's done internally will actually put us in jeopardy externally. And so then it becomes a way of managing communities, right, or silencing certain things, of stopping conversations. And so for me, thinking about what long-term security looks like is thinking about what it takes on a really practical level, on a political level, internal, external, like national, so that, right, there's enough long-term security in whatever way is necessary so that we can have contention or conversations within our communities that doesn't then, or at least be seen as putting the community at risk at a larger level, right? So I'm thinking about the type of activism within the Two-Spirit community where people will say, what about our traditional practices around gender and sexuality and kinship, and what about why do we have, so you know, why is there a law that says marriage is only a man and a woman? Why is there this practice, or why can't particular identities be recognized within our communities? And a lot of the conversation is around this is bad press, or this is something, these kinds of conversations may actually put our sovereignty in jeopardy. So that I think is it's a different scale maybe, or a different way that sovereignty is working. But for me, long-term security for everyone, but also for the long-term robustness and security of our communities means that sovereignty is also not something that is wielded down, right, in a way that may actually hurt something like security for all or with all. So that's the main way when I think about it, because I do often have a kind of visceral response to things and recognizing the importance of something like sovereignty at a national level and thinking about recognition, but also thinking about the ways that maybe it gets used, or the threat or anxiety around sovereignty and being recognized as sovereign may actually work inside communities in a different way than it works external to them. And the other thing I thought of when we were thinking about security is we've talked about that UN declaration that you brought up, and the fact that it was set up to secure and kind of secure nation-state rights, but at the same time there were 4 countries that refused to sign it, that saw it so threatening, right? The US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia refused to sign that declaration because even with those contingencies of saying nothing that disrupts the nation state, it was still so dangerous, right? So I'm always kind of interested in that moment of like, yes, it's very kid glove, right, in thinking about who it protects and how it does, and even that slight, right, recognition or that kid glove treatment was treated as a long-term threat. So I think that's an interesting point to think about, like what that does in terms of long-term security.
Okay. Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really good note to segue to audience questions. And can you just